This all started back in the fall of 2022. I just moved into this sprawling, slightly rundown apartment complex in Portland, Oregon, the Willows they called it, though I never saw any willow trees. I'd landed a remote web developer gig, and after years of cramped, noisy life in downtown Seattle, I craved solitude. Portland seemed like a good compromise, still urban but greener, quieter. The Willows was a bargain, one of those sprawling 60s buildings with long, echoey hallways painted a depressing shade of beige, smelling faintly of dampness and old cooking. My corner unit on the second floor felt like a sanctuary at first, a bit isolated at the end of the hall, overlooking a dense thicket of woods. Perfect, I thought, for focusing on code and forgetting the world. But the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. From day one, I felt a presence I couldn't pinpoint. My next-door neighbor, a Mrs. Gable, was a complete enigma. Her name was on the mailbox, slightly faded, but that was my only proof she existed. I never saw her enter or leave, but her presence was undeniable. Every time I walked down that long hallway, I felt an intense awareness coming from her door. Sometimes, just as I'd reach my own door, fumbling for keys, I'd hear it, the softest click from her peephole. A tiny metallic sound that signaled I was being observed. If I dared to glance over, it was always just a solid brown door, impassive and silent. It sent a shiver down my spine every single time. Then came the music, faint classical violin. It would start at the most ungodly hours, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., sometimes in the dead quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. It was never loud, just a thin, reedy sound seeping through the wall. I tried to identify the pieces using music apps, but it was always too faint, too distorted, or it would stop the moment I tried. That was the truly unsettling part. Any sound I made, a cough, a dropped pen shifting in my chair, even the click of my mouse, and the music would cut off instantly. Not fade out, but stop. Abruptly. It felt calculated. It felt like I was living next to someone or something whose sole purpose was to listen to me. I tried to brush it off. You wanted quiet, you got quiet, I told myself. It's an old building, thin walls, maybe she's just a lonely old woman. I buried myself in work, built firewalls, designed user interfaces, trying to create order in my digital world while chaos brewed next door. But at night, lying in bed, the silence would stretch and I'd find myself holding my breath, listening for the violin, dreading its return. Things took a turn about a month in. My apartment had this small, perpetually damp patio. One chilly October morning, I pulled back the curtains for some much-needed light and saw it. Sitting dead center on the small, rusted patio table was a single, perfect, white rose. Except it wasn't perfect. It was dead. Completely dry, its petals brittle and brown-edged, yet somehow retaining its shape. It looked ancient. My heart did a weird lurch. It was impossible. My patio was on the second floor. The woods behind were thick, but no branches came close. There were no balconies above mine. How could anyone have gotten there? I stared at the rose, my mind racing through impossible scenarios. A bird? A weird prank by kids, though I rarely saw any? It made no sense. Feeling a strange mix of fear and revulsion, I slid the glass door open, the cold, damp air hitting my face, and picked it up. It felt weightless, fragile. I didn't want it near me. I flung it over the railing, watching it disappear into the green-brown undergrowth. I double-checked the lock on the patio door, feeling foolish but scared. The next morning it was back. Another dead, white rose sitting in the exact same spot. This time I didn't touch it. I just stared through the glass, feeling a cold dread creep up my spine. It stayed there for a day, a silent, decaying sentinel. The third morning it was joined by another. Now there were two. This went on for a week. Every morning, a new dead rose appeared, until a small, macabre bouquet sat on my patio table. I stopped opening the curtains. I started avoiding that side of the apartment. The music from Mrs. Gable's apartment continued its arrhythmic schedule, but now it felt less like an annoyance and more like a soundtrack to the bizarre flower deliveries. I knew I needed proof, something tangible, or I really would lose my mind. I ordered a cheap Wi-Fi security camera online. When it arrived, I set it up on my bookshelf, aimed squarely at the patio door. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the live feed on my phone, waiting. Nothing. Just the rain-slicked glass and the dark woods beyond. The next morning, my heart pounded as I checked the recordings. I fast-forwarded through hours of black and white night vision footage. Nothing. Rain. Shadows. Then, right around 3:15 a.m., I saw it. Or rather, I didn't see it. In one frame, the table was empty. In the very next frame, a fraction of a second later, a new rose was sitting there. There was no flicker, no movement, no sign of anything approaching or leaving. It was like a magic trick, a terrifying, impossible glitch in reality. The camera hadn't helped. It had only made things worse, confirming that whatever was happening wasn't normal. My rational explanations crumbled. I thought about the police, but the image of trying to explain ghost flowers and impossible video footage made my stomach clench. They'd think I was high or having a breakdown. Then came the tapping. I was working late again, the pressure mounting, the violin music next door starting its eerie serenade. I tried to drown it out with headphones, but then I felt it more than heard it. A vibration through the couch. Tap, 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 coming from the wall. Mrs. Gable's wall. It was soft, hesitant, like someone testing the plaster. Tap, tap, tap. I ripped off my headphones. The room was silent except for that sound. It moved, traveling a few feet down the wall, then stopped. It felt incredibly personal, like a direct message. It felt like an invitation. Or a warning. I sat frozen, every nerve ending screaming. The tapping stopped, and an even deeper silence fell. Even the ever-present Portland drizzle seemed to pause. I didn't move, didn't breathe for what felt like an hour. When I finally crept to the wall and pressed my ear against it, I heard nothing. No music, no movement, just the cold, indifferent plaster. Life became a strange dance of avoidance and obsession. I stopped using my living room after dark. I started checking the locks on my doors and windows multiple times before bed. I found myself finding the patio door lock unlocked on 3 separate occasions, even though I was certain I had secured it. The first time I blamed myself, stress, forgetfulness. The second time I felt a wave of nausea. The third time I bought a heavy-duty chain lock and drilled it into the frame, landlord be damned. I needed more eyes. I bought 2 more cameras. One went in the living room, angled to catch both the patio door and the shared wall. The other went in the short hallway leading to my front door, aimed right at the only entrance and incidentally the wall facing Mrs. Gable's apartment. I set them to record both audio and video, hoping to catch something. Anything. For a while my paranoia seemed to pay off, or maybe it was just a lull. The tapping stopped. No new flowers appeared, though the old ones remained, a withered monument on the patio table. The violin music became less frequent. I started to cautiously hope that whatever it was, it had moved on, gotten bored, or that I had finally imagined the whole thing. I almost convinced myself. Then came the work conference in Seattle. I had to be gone for 3 days. Leaving the apartment felt like leaving a part of myself undefended. I checked the cameras, the locks, the windows, feeling a rising panic. As I walked down the hall, I swear I saw the curtain twitch in Mrs. Gable's window overlooking the walkway, but when I looked back, it was still. The conference was a blur. I couldn't focus. I kept checking the live feed on my phone. My empty, silent apartment looked normal, peaceful even. I felt a surge of relief. Maybe I really was the problem. I got back late Sunday night, exhausted. The apartment felt different, colder, stale. The air was heavy. I dumped my bags and went straight for my laptop to check the camera footage. The video files showed nothing. 3 days of an empty, silent apartment. No flowers, no unlocked doors, no intruders. Maybe it was over. But then I checked the audio files. The living room audio was clean, just the usual building creaks and distant traffic. But the hallway camera, it had picked something up. Faint. So faint, I had to put on headphones and crank the volume, filtering out the hum of the refrigerator. Whispers. Dry, raspy whispers, seemingly coming from inside my apartment, near the front door. They were mostly unintelligible, but every now and then a word would surface. Words like cold and listen. And then, unmistakably, my name. Chloe. Whispered over and over again. My blood turned to ice. It had been inside, while I was gone. I listened to that audio loop a dozen times, each repetition tightening the knot of terror in my chest. It felt like a violation of the deepest kind. It knew my name. It had been in here. I couldn't stay. I started frantically throwing clothes into a suitcase, my mind a jumble of fear and flight. I needed to get out. Now, as I rushed towards the door, suitcase banging against my legs, my eyes fell on something lying on the floor, just inside the threshold. It hadn't been there when I came in. It was a small manila envelope, slightly yellowed, with no markings. It looked like it had been slid under the door. My hands trembled so hard I could barely pick it up. It felt strangely light. Inside there was a single photograph. An old Polaroid, the colors faded and shifted towards yellow. It showed a bedroom. It took me a second to realize it was my bedroom, but it looked wrong. Older. The furniture was mine, but it seemed shrouded, dusty. And in the bed there was a figure. sleeping. The photo was taken from the corner of the room, near the ceiling. An impossible angle. An angle that meant someone or something had been standing right there watching me. Watching me for a long, long time. That was it. I didn't grab anything else. I left the suitcase, the laptop, everything. I ran out of that apartment, down the long, silent hallway, not daring to glance at Mrs. Gable's door. I ran down the stairs, out into the rainy Portland night, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove to a friend's house, shaking and crying, unable to articulate the full extent of the horror. I called the landlord the next day, broke the lease, told him to keep the deposit, keep everything. He just sounded tired. Another one, I thought I heard him mutter before he hung up. I moved. I found a new place, a bright, modern building with lots of neighbors and thin walls where I can hear everything. TVs, arguments, laughter. Normal sounds. But sometimes, late at night, when the city quiets down and the rain is falling, I think I hear it. A faint, distant violin. And I wonder if Mrs. Gable ever misses her neighbor. I make my living exploring ghosts of the past. My YouTube channel, Abandoned Echoes, isn't about jump scares. It's about capturing the lingering atmosphere, the stories trapped in decaying walls. My partner, Jake, is the tech guy and the lookout, though mostly he's there because going into these places alone is just asking for trouble. This particular trip, back in the spring of 2023, felt different. We got a solid tip about St. Jude's Hospital, a massive, crumbling structure on the edge of Detroit. It had been empty since the late 80s, a magnet for local legends, ghost nurses, phantom patients, the works. Standard stuff, but the sheer scale of the place and the lack of other explorers' footage made it irresistible. We packed heavy, high-lumen flashlights, multiple camera angles including body cams, audio gear, a medkit, and a pair of powerful walkie-talkies. We knew cell service would be a joke. We found our entry point, a busted-out window on the ground floor, hidden by overgrown bushes. The moment we stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was thick with the smell of dust, mold, and something else. Something vaguely chemical like old antiseptic. It was huge, a labyrinth of peeling paint, overturned gurneys, and shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of our flashlight beams. This place is epic, Jake breathed, his camera already rolling. We started a slow sweep of the ground floor, the old ER, a cavernous lobby, x-ray rooms with shattered screens. It was creepy but nothing overtly strange. We decided the real stories were likely upstairs. The old surgical wing on the second floor was our target. The main staircase was wide and imposing, but littered with debris. As we started climbing, my walkie crackled. Not a voice, just loud, sharp static like a burst of energy. "Jake, you messing with me?" I asked, turning. He was a few steps below me, shaking his head, his own walkie silent. "Mine's dead quiet, man." The static hit again and then a voice cut through it. It wasn't human. It was distorted, gurgling like it was being filtered through water or a broken speaker. It said, clear as a bell despite the distortion, "He's still on the third floor." We froze mid-step. Every hair on my arm stood on end. "Tell me you heard that," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. I nodded, unable to speak. We hadn't seen a soul. No squatters, no other explorers. And the voice, it didn't sound like it was coming from the walkie but through it from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold. And it said third floor. We were heading up. "Maybe we should bail," Jake said, his eyes wide, scanning the shadows above us. But Abandoned Echoes wasn't built on bailing. "No way," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We document. We stay cautious. Let's hit the second floor as planned." We reached the second floor landing, our flashlights cutting nervous arcs through the darkness. The surgical wing stretched out before us. We found the main nurse's station, a semicircle of counters, charts spilled across the floor, broken vials crunching underfoot. On the wall was an old metal intercom panel, pocked with buttons and a speaker grill. As I zoomed in with my camera, it happened. A loud, ear-splitting buzz erupted from the speaker. It wasn't a quick sound. It went on for 5, maybe 6 seconds, echoing down the empty corridor. We both yelled, stumbling back. There was no power in this building. None. We checked. The buzz stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving a ringing silence. "Okay," Jake stammered. Official weirdness level just hit 11. We pushed on, though our bravery was rapidly turning into stupidity. The operating rooms were chilling, heavy steel doors, empty hooks where lights once hung, the floor stained with things I didn't want to think about. In an adjoining office we hit pay dirt, or so we thought. Old patient intake logs. Huge, heavy books, coated in a thick layer of grime, but surprisingly preserved. We blew the dust off and started flipping through. Most of it was boring administrative data from decades ago. But then we started seeing them, handwritten notes in the margins, scrawled in faded blue ink. They seemed to center around one area, Ward C, Room 7. The notes were chilling. Patient in 7 claims, shadow man watches him. Refuses meds. Doesn't sleep. Talks to the walls. Says they talk back. Dr. Miller saw him again near bed 7. Not a patient. Security notified. Bed 7. Cold spot reported again. Patient hysterical. Who was him? And what was happening in bed 7? We had to find it. According to a faded map on the wall, Ward C was at the far end of the wing. We navigated through corridors filled with debris, our footsteps echoing unnervingly. We found Ward C, and then at the very end of the hall, Room 7. It was smaller than the others, almost like an isolation room. The door was ajar. It felt significantly colder than the rest of the floor, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the outside air. I raised my camera, taking a deep breath. "All right, Jake, stay close," I whispered. As I pushed the door open, a sound ripped through the silence. Slam. Further back down the hall, one of the heavy steel operating room doors we'd passed earlier slammed shut with incredible force. It echoed like a gunshot. Jake screamed, not a word, just a raw sound of terror, and spun around, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "Did you see it? Did you see it?" he yelled, scrambling backward. "What? See what?" I yelled back, panning my camera down the hall, seeing only the now closed metal door. The shadow. When the door slammed, a shadow, it detached itself from the wall and flowed down the hall, away from us. It was huge, man. "I'm out. I'm out now." This time there was no arguing. The sheer panic in his voice was infectious. We turned and ran, not bothering with stealth, slipping on debris, a symphony of panicked footsteps and ragged breaths chasing us down the corridors. We didn't stop until we burst back out through the broken window, gasping in the afternoon sun, covered in dust and sweat. Jake refused to talk much about it afterward. He helped edit the footage, but he never went on another exploration. When I reviewed the audio from the intercom buzz, I found it. Slowed down, filtered, it wasn't just a buzz. It was a voice, stretched and distorted, but clear enough. Get out. It was chilling, but it made great content. The episode blew up, but the comments section was interesting. A few months after it aired, someone claiming to be an ex-security guard for a company hired to watch St. Jude's posted a long comment. He talked about quitting after a week because he kept hearing footsteps, seeing shadows, and feeling an unbearable sense of dread, especially when he had to patrol near the old operating wing and the sealed-off 3rd floor. I moved out to rural Ohio in 2022 looking for a break. My job as a vet tech in the city had burned me out, too much sadness, too much noise. I found this old farmhouse for rent, ridiculously cheap. It was definitely a fixer-upper, with peeling paint and a sagged porch, but it had acres of land and a silence I craved. The only thing I genuinely disliked was the cellar. It wasn't a proper basement, just an old root cellar, accessed by this heavy old-fashioned wooden hatch right in the middle of the kitchen floor. It smelled perpetually of damp earth, mildew, and something vaguely sweet like rotting apples. It gave me the creeps, so I only went down there once, tossed in some boxes I didn't need, and did my best to ignore its existence. The first couple of months were blissfully quiet. Just the sound of crickets and the wind in the trees. But as summer deepened, a new sound joined the night's chorus. Scraping. A dry, dragging sound like fingernails on rough wood, or maybe rocks being dragged across concrete. It always came from directly beneath the kitchen floor, directly beneath the cellar hatch. It started small, almost ignorable, happening between 1 and 3 a.m. Raccoons, I told myself firmly, or groundhogs. It's an old house in the country. But the sound grew more insistent, sometimes frantic, sometimes slow and deliberate. Sounded big. Then came the cold, earthy draft. Even with the heavy hatch firmly closed, an unnerving chill would seep up from the floorboards, pooling in the kitchen. It carried that distinct cellar smell, but it felt wrong. It felt like something down there was exhaling. I started stuffing towels around the edges of the hatch, but the cold and the smell always found a way through. I finally called Mr. Peterson, the farmer who owned the place. He was a nice enough guy, but weathered and skeptical. He came over, listened, stomped on the hatch. "She's solid," he declared. "Probably just the house settling, or maybe some field mice. Happens all the time in these old places. Don't you worry your head about it." But as he was leaving, he paused at the door. "You know," he said, not quite meeting my eye, "my grandma used to say this old house had character. said some things are best left undisturbed. It wasn't exactly reassuring. The scraping continued. One night, I came home absolutely exhausted after a 14-hour shift involving a horse with colic. I walked into the kitchen, dropped my bag, and froze. The heavy toolbox I'd placed squarely on top of the hatch was slid several inches to the side. And the hatch itself was open. Just a crack, maybe an inch. Blackness gaped up at me. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew I hadn't moved that toolbox. Panic warred with exhaustion. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet, my makeshift weapon, and cautiously approached. I nudged the hatch open with my foot, leaning over, trying to peer into the darkness. The single bare bulb down there was controlled by an old-fashioned pull chain. I definitely wasn't reaching in. But then I saw it. Lit only by the dim kitchen light filtering down, the pull chain was swinging. Slowly, rhythmically, back and forth, as if an unseen hand had just let it go. I slammed the hatch shut so hard the whole kitchen seemed to shake. I didn't just push the toolbox back. I dragged the heavy oak kitchen table over it, wedging it tight. I spent the rest of that night huddled on the couch, skillet by my side, jumping at every creak. The next day, ignoring any potential damage to the floor, I went to the hardware store and bought the biggest, heaviest padlock and hasp set I could find. I spent an hour drilling and screwing it into the thick wooden hatch and the surrounding floorboards. It looked ugly, but it felt safe. Or safer anyway. For nearly a month there was peace. No scraping, no draft, no swinging light chains. The padlock held firm. I started to believe Mr. Peterson was right, that it had been an animal and I'd finally sealed it out. I started to sleep through the night again. I let my guard down. Then came the morning. I walked into the kitchen and found the coffee mug I'd left on the counter shattered on the floor. At first I thought maybe I'd left it too close to the edge. But then I looked at the hatch. The padlock was still there, securely locked. But the hinges on the opposite side, they were a mangled wreck. The thick iron was bent upwards, twisted at grotesque angles. The wood around them was splintered. Something had tried to force its way up through the hatch with enough power to bend metal, but not enough to break the lock. The hatch itself was slightly buckled, a permanent, terrifying warp in the wood. The idea of some animal doing that was laughable. The force required, it was unthinkable. I felt sick. I knew I had to leave, but I felt trapped, needing to give notice, to pack. I decided to stick it out for a few more days, sleeping with my door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. The very last night, I was packing boxes in the living room, trying to ignore the pulsing silence from the kitchen. Around midnight, I went to the kitchen sink to get some water. As I stood there, the tap running, I heard it. It wasn't scraping. It wasn't a draft. It was a giggle. A high-pitched, gleeful child's giggle. It wasn't loud, but it was horrifyingly clear. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the room. It sounded like it was bubbling up from the pipes, coming up through the sink drain. That was it. I didn't pack another thing. I grabbed my purse, my dog, and my car keys and ran. I drove for hours, ending up at a motel 3 states away. I never went back, just called Mr. Peterson and told him he could keep everything. He didn't sound surprised. Later, a morbid curiosity I couldn't suppress led me to research the property's history online. I found an old article from a local paper in the 1950s. It mentioned the farmhouse, the family who lived there, and the tragic day their 7-year-old daughter, Emily, disappeared while playing near the old, stone-lined well in the backyard. The well had collapsed a few days later during a storm. They never found her body. They just filled it in. Filled it in right near where the cellar had been dug. Sometimes, even now, when I hear a kid laugh unexpectedly, my blood runs cold.